Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming along this morning. Today we're going to be doing this workshop on inspecting WCAG 2.2 accessible authentication. Just a quick intro, really. This is our third in a series of planned WCAG 2.2 workshops. So yeah, thanks very much for your patience if we end up having any like quirks or awkward moments related to the format. It's only the third time we've done it, so yeah, we're still a little bit unpracticed, and this is my first time doing it, so sometimes I might stumble a little bit. But yeah, we are recording this session today, and once it's done, we'll be uploading it to the Government Digital Service YouTube channel, and we can share a link to that in the chat later. So yeah, feel free to take screenshots of the slides, that's absolutely fine, but try not to take screenshots of your fellow attendees because some people might not want to appear on the video. We will also share in the chat a link to this slide deck so that you've got it for later and you can use it, so you can sort of download a copy of that. And we'll also share a link to the HTML version of the slides as well. So this is a safe space for learning, so please be kind and feel free to speak openly. We do have a code of conduct that will be shared in the chat as well, which we'd ask you to follow. But really the main thing to say is that, yeah, because it's a safe space for learning, we're welcoming any and all comments and questions. There are absolutely no silly questions. These guidelines are brand new, and so we're going to be learning together by working through them. But yeah, some important pieces of context for this workshop. We are not the experts and we might not have all the right answers. Like I said, we're exploring this criterion with you. So we're sort of looking through how it might work, and actually having you along with us is going to be really beneficial, because any questions that you have, we can sort of explore the answers together. This is sometimes a bit of a misconception, but yeah, our team doesn't own or write the accessibility guidelines. That's done by another organization, but we do interpret them for service teams working in government, and try and make some of that guidance available in the design system website. If you notice something that we say isn't quite right, please do feel free to bring it up in this space. So you can sort of raise your hand or message in the chat, and I'll give you a little guide on how to do that next. And also we encourage positive discussion and conversation. So please do use the chat freely, ask questions. And if you prefer to sort of talk to us, raise your hand, and then you could just like unmute and talk to us that way. So how do you do that? Yeah, if you could stay on mute while you're not talking, that would be fab. And then you can use the raise hand option in the reactions menu during discussion times. If you want to practice that safely now, go for it. We will ignore any raised hands that are used right now. There you go. People have started to use it, so that's good. Yeah, so these meeting hygiene points will apply in the breakout discussion rooms as well. So we will be using some breakout discussion rooms today, but just to note that the recordings won't happen there. We won't be able to save anything that you sort of say in the chat or that you say to other people. So yeah, if someone you're in a breakout room with says something really insightful and clever, write it down. We can't record that for you. And finally, if you'd like to find out more about when we're putting on some of these events, please do sign up to our mailing list, which we'll put in the chat shortly. You can find out about some of the events that we'll be running there, and also like any time that we make an update to the design system itself. So the plan for today, first of all, we're going to be talking about WCAG 2.2 and this workshop series. Then we'll go on to talk about the specific criterion we're looking at today, accessible authentication. Then we'll be sort of demonstrating an example of that. And then we'll lead into this group activity in breakout rooms. Once that activity has happened, we'll regroup and discuss it, like see what you came up with and what you explored. And then towards the end, we'll wrap it up. And just to make sure that we're doing these things well, we'll run a little retrospective as well. So you'll be able to give us some feedback on how today's session went. All of today's links and resources can be found in our workshop Google Doc, which will also be put in the chat shortly. So yeah, that will save you from having to save and copy from the chat and make bookmarks of everything. You don't have to do that. You can just use that document there. Who we got here today? So I'm Steve. I'm the product manager on the Gov.UK design system. And we've got David, who is our senior accessibility specialist. And then we've also got Kelly, who's our delivery manager, and she's going to be sort of like moderating the chat and keeping an eye on things. Most of this is going to be David, and so I'm going to pass over to him now.
All right, thanks, Steve. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. It should say, what is WCAG 2.2? I've just got to rearrange a few things though, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll get started in just a couple seconds. All right, so we're going to start with a brief overview. We've done this, if you've joined us for any of the other 2 workshops we've done, this will not be new to you, but it will be new to some folks. So we've got it in here. And also things have changed since we last met in July. So WCAG is what we're calling it. That's how I pronounce it, WCAG or WCAG sometimes. But basically, it's an acronym that stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And what it is it's a series of these success criteria that are put together that generally they're called the recommendations, but it's basically a series of guidelines on how to make web things accessible. That's the very basic version of it. As far as the 2.2 part of WCAG 2.2, it's a version of WCAG that's just been as of October 5th of this year, 2020 version update. And I say just a version update, what does that mean? Basically, it's downloadable content of a web standard. So it's the DLC. So it's got a bit of an expansion pack vibe. There's more criteria to choose from, aka more criteria to meet or to look at meeting. There's an updated glossary of definitions to help clarify some of the things in there. And there was also a last minute removal of one of the criteria that was in there before. So let's take a look at the 9 criteria that were added as part of WCAG 2.2. You'll see them on the screen there. I'll go through the ones that we've been focusing on with this workshop. Or actually, I'll just go through them all. So there's focus not obscured, which is if you're tabbing through or like changing the focus to things, make sure that it's not obscured by anything. There's nothing over top of it. Focus appearance, which is the look and the sizing of focuses. So once again, having to do with like keyboard navigation and potentially screen reader navigation, depending on the operating system you're using. And then there's dragging movements, which basically was don't make it so that interactions can only be done by like clicking and dragging or selecting and dragging movements, because those can't really be done easily through all the different modalities that people use to access the internet or move around in applications. And then there's target size, which once again, I'm going real quick through this, is make sure targets are not too small to actually select them and aren't too close together that you're going to make errors when you're trying to select between them. Consistent help. I like this one because it's pretty simple. Make help consistent. So if there's any help tools you have, place them consistently in the pages and in the journeys. Redundant entry, which is basically don't ask for information twice unless you really need to. If someone's giving you stuff, use that, or give an option to pre-populate the stuff that's already been offered. And then the one we're getting to today, which is accessible authentication, which we'll get into more detail, but basically any sort of login process, try to make it accessible. WCAG 2.2 is now published as a full recommendation. Put all those cheering emojis in the chat. Yeah, so this happened on October 5th. It took a while. It's been going on for, I think, 3 or 4 years now, at the very least, that this has been sort of in the strong form of development. But yeah, it's kind of the latest version since the previous one, 2.1, which came out in 2018. The UK government, for those in sort of the UK government space, as our team is, we have an accessibility monitoring body. It's actually one of the sibling teams of ours within the government digital service. And they're going to start checking services and websites against these new WCAG 2.2 criteria a year after the recommendation is published. So that'll be October 2024. That being said, it is technically legally required to meet it now, but this is sort of a grace period where they realize that's not something that can be done reasonably by every team to immediately have everything fully meeting recommendations that just came out a few weeks ago. So our team, the Gov.UK design system, we plan to update our code base and guidance within 6 months of it being published. So that'll be sort of between now and April 2024 is when we're going to be putting out sort of a release. Our WCAG 2.2 release is sort of what we've been calling it internally, where we'll have our guidance updated for the more service design aspects of a service. And then we'll have our code base updated Gov.UK front end for the more code-based updates, the things that you can actually put in code and it's good to go. So yeah, we're hoping for a bit sooner than that 6-month mark, but that's our goal. And about this workshop series. So this is the third of a series of 3. So this is the final one we're running, and it's also the final one before I leave my position here at the Gov.UK design system. So that's sort of partially the reason for that. And it's, yeah, bittersweet, but I'm moving back to Canada. So it was sort of a logical thing to not try to work from Canada at London times, which would have been 5 a.m. is when I would start. But yeah, so moving on, but that's okay. The workshop series itself was developed for a few different reasons. So one of the reasons being that some of the criteria in WCAG 2.2 can be pretty complicated to test for. It takes some calculations, it takes using the browser inspect tools. That's not entirely the case with this one, but we'll talk about that in a second. Reason number 2 is that service teams in the UK government are going to need to do more than just WCAG 2.2 compliance going. So there's a bunch of service design pieces also included in this. Reason 3 is we want to make sure that our design system updates we're making are based on sort of good interpretations of WCAG 2.2, since, as Steve said, we didn't write it, but we are sort of taking the time to go through and ingest it and try to get our design system to align with it as much as we can. Yeah, it's not going to be great if everyone's using a different method to measure what meeting WCAG 2.2 looks like. So these meetings are sort of, or these workshops are a chance for people to speak up as well, using like the raise hands feature and in breakouts and in question times to, yeah, help everyone sort of align and ensure that we're consistently looking at this stuff from the same lens, from the same viewpoint. And yeah, we're not wildly interpreting it differently. So we've covered 2 criteria so far, focus not obscured and target size, and now we're on accessible authentication. Previously, we were going to do focus not obscured, target size, and then focus appearance, but we swapped that for accessible authentication for a couple different reasons. The first being that focus appearance was moved in the actual guidelines from the AA level, which is sort of the standard most services try to meet, to the AAA level, which is sort of like above and beyond, or just like other ways to improve accessibility. It's more than that, but that's sort of like what it ends up being, which to me feels like a shame. It would have been really nice to have a great focus appearance criterion in there, but there are reasons for that, why that was done. A lot of them coming down to the complexity of testability. And I will say it's still worth looking at focus appearance as a criterion and as a concept, and considering different ways that you can improve both the size of your focus states as well as the visibility of your focus states. But we figured since it's at the AA level, we'll look at accessible authentication specifically, because that's likely to affect basically all the service teams that have accounts and that have logins across sort of the ecosystem. And there's a bunch of different tools and tips and different things to consider with accessible authentication. So while there's maybe not complex calculations and spreadsheets involved, there is a lot of thought and things to hold in your head all at once. All right, hopefully we're good, and I'll move on. So the learning portions of these 3 workshops are being recorded, as you can see, and they'll be published to the Government Digital Service YouTube channel whenever we get to successfully cleaning up the captions and transcripts, because they are hour-long videos. And moving on, yeah, so today's workshop, we've got sort of 4 things going on here. We're hoping it but will be involving some discussion, some note-taking, some heads, as well as idea sharing at the end there. And now we're going to go into the so as was done with the previous 3 workshops, which comes from the UK government's accessibility monitoring team. They did a presentation in May, and then we'll go into a quick check that I've made sort of internally for our team to sort of give you an idea of what to look for. And then we go into the deep dive, which is sort of the rest of it, all the sort of thoughts and stream of consciousness that there is to say on accessible authentication as far as I've found so far. So yes, accessible authentication, the minimum version of it is at the AA level. And essentially, as the accessibility monitoring team has said, logging in must not rely on a cognitive test is sort of the big headline here. So this is likely going to be like several small tweaks to the concepts of like logging in or authenticating users and stuff like that. They've got an example on the slide here, and it's the Touch ID for NHS app. And I think they've sort of looked at that and noted that Touch ID is sort of an accessible way to authenticate within a login because it's not really asking for a cognitive function text, which is their like the way they say like solve a problem or transcribe this or what's 2 + 2, those sort of things. But yeah, so examples of what would be inaccessible authentication would be remembering a password without the option of autofill. So if autofill is disabled, manually entering a security code from another device, which we often call like two-factor authentication, if that it's specifically the manually entering part of that, not having the security code, that doesn't make it inaccessible, but it's having people have to like memorize for short term, like 5 to 6 characters and transcribe them over. And then doing a maths problem. So that is literally a test that uses cognitive function. So therefore it's a cognitive function test. And then solving a puzzle as well. So all those are sort of pieces that this criterion or this pair of criteria are sort of set to try to phase out to improve accessibility, especially for people with cognitive accessibility needs. And let's look at examples of accessible authentication. So asking for passwords where there's also support for what's called like a mechanism, such as password managers, autofill. So password managers can be the ones like built into browsers, can be external ones from different companies. Copying and pasting a security code from the same device is also considered accessible. So if you're able to somehow get that code back onto the device where the logging in is happening, then that makes it accessible. Recognizing objects at the AA level is considered like okay to go. I think that one had sort of a hard fought battle as to whether it should be okay or not. But the idea of like select the trains, select the fire hydrants, that sort of thing at the AA level is still considered like, it is a cognitive function test, let's be honest. And it also requires visuals, but that was sort of given an exception. And then identifying images the user has provided. So any sort of like non-text content that the user has previously uploaded can be used as authentication as well. An example that they give is like, if you upload an image when you first sign up for an account as sort of like your security image that you'll have to be able to identify later, then that is considered something that's allowed. You can sort of use that as like identify which image you uploaded and it's good to go. This is a note that was sort of added after the presentation in May, that it is okay to use a less accessible method as long as there's also an alternative provided. So this sort of comes into play when we're talking about things like CAPTCHA, where there could be a mainstream CAPTCHA, but if there's also an alternative, that's okay. Examples of that are often, there's like multiple versions of CAPTCHA offered. So there might be a visual CAPTCHA and there might be an audio CAPTCHA as well. That doesn't mean that just having a visual and audio CAPTCHA means you pass accessible authentication, but it is a thing to note that this isn't restricting you to only having like one perfect path. There can be multiple sort of alternatives offered. There is also a AAA version of accessible authentication, which I've hinted at, and that drops the object recognition and the user provided content exceptions. So then recognizing objects is no longer really an option, and asking people to pick out sort of like the images or the content that they've provided and select which one is theirs is also no longer allowed there. So that's the one from the accessibility monitoring body. We'll go into the quick check version now. And this is sort of what I've called like a detective skill. And basically it's a way to figure out if there's something fishy going on. And that's about as far as it goes. So in this one, if there is a login process with some sort of test, something that a user needs to remember in order to get through, or I suppose, this is another clue. If there's no autofill options for the inputs within that login process. Those are all clues that it might be worth taking a closer look and seeing how this is interacting with accessible authentication. All right, and now we abandon everything and jump right into the big part, the deep dive for accessible authentication. So right into it, we're going to go straight into what's actually in the guidelines themselves. The actual text from WCAG 2.2 criterion 3.3.8 starts with a cognitive function test, such as remembering a password or solving a puzzle, is not required for any step in an authentication process. So there's a bit to unpack there, but basically, there, and I've also added extra definitions in the slide notes. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. So there's a definition for the cognitive function test. I won't go into it too much, but basically, yeah, it's things such as solving a puzzle or remembering a password, but they also have like precise definitions available. But yeah, and then there's 4 exceptions to that as well. So you can't do that unless one of these 4 applies, and that is you provide an alternative. So another authentication method that does not rely on a cognitive function test, as was said, that makes it a-okay. Providing an assistive mechanism, so a mechanism that is available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test. Examples of that are like password managers, as was said, or the ability to copy and paste in, which helps reduce the burden of having to retype things from memory. Moving on, there's using object recognition, which has been talked about, with the note that that won't pass the AAA level. A side note on this one that they give is that object recognition, and the next one as well, can be done through images, video, or audio. Objects aren't just like visual things. They can also be audio and video. And then, yeah, the same for personal content. That can be images, audio, video. And basically, if the cognitive function test is to identify non-text content the user provided to the website, that's okay to use as like a test, basically. It still is a cognitive function test, and it wouldn't be allowed in AAA at the AA level. So along with this sort of the big guideline piece, the success criterion, they also provide 2 understanding documents for accessible authentication. I think maybe Kelly, if you can put the 2 links I've got in the chat there. But yeah, so basically there's one for the minimum level, which is AA, and then the enhanced level, which is AAA. And we're going to go mostly into those now, because that's sort of where the weird stuff starts happening. The tragic reveal I have for you is tragic to me, I suppose, maybe not tragic to others, is that accessible authentication is strictly limited to logins with WCAG. That like it doesn't go outside the bounds of logins. That's sort of the hard stop, where after that, the guideline isn't covering anything other than that. So just because you can apply the word authentication to something within your service doesn't mean that this WCAG 2.2 criterion accessible authentication applies to that. And as far as I can tell, and this is where I'm going to ask, I don't know if I can see hands, but if anyone actually here knows if I'm wrong, please tell me right now, because this is going to be what we talk about for the next little bit. But yeah, it doesn't appear like it appears to not apply in a lot of cases, basically, because being only within login means there's a lot of stuff not in logins. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone correcting me, so we'll continue on with that understanding for now. But yes, so once you go into the understanding document, some of the things it says right at the top, which help to sort of set the scene for the whole thing, is the goal of this criterion is to make logins possible with less mental effort. So make logins possible with less mental effort. What you gotta do is don't make people solve, recall, or transcribe something to log in. Once again, to log in. And why it's important, this one kind of brings it out to a broader scope. Some people with cognitive disabilities cannot solve puzzles, memorize a username and password, or retype one-time passcodes. You'll note the why it's important does not mention logins. This is something that it is like difficult for people with cognitive disabilities, regardless of where they are in a service. It's not something that suddenly, once they get to a login process, it becomes really difficult. This is consistently difficult across a whole service. But yeah, those 3 points pretty much sum up what these WCAG 2.2 criterion care about, or what they're focused on specifically. What does that mean? Many non-login processes could potentially remain out of scope and could potentially remain inaccessible if this is followed to the letter. It's still worthwhile and it's very important to make logins accessible. But what does this leave out? So first thing it leaves out is sign up and registrations. So creating a new account, that's not a login process, that's a sign up process. Signing a petition of some sort, that's not a login process. Applying to join something like a private beta, while yeah, that's fairly similar to a sign up, but you don't actually get to that point where you're signing up, that would also not be covered. And that those are 3 places where these sort of mechanisms that we have for accessible authentication, where we might have cognitive function tests and the like. CAPTCHAs outside of logins also don't count. So CAPTCHAs are used across various services outside of the login process, whether it's uploading a file, submitting a form, or preventing or putting up protective measures for things like distributed denial of service attacks. I think I should also maybe give a definition for what CAPTCHAs are at this point, for those who have heard it said a few times. So it stands for completely automated public Turing test to tell humans and computers apart, or to tell computers and humans apart. But basically, it is a test to see whether the thing interacting with a website is a person or a human. It's a category of technologies used to ensure that a human is making an online transaction rather than a computer. And they come in many different forms and many different sort of tricks and methods, but that's the general idea of a CAPTCHA. And then the third sort of category is IDs for authentication also don't count. So this is one that came up a lot for us in the design system because we're within the government and the government has and owns a lot of IDs. So that means that national insurance numbers don't count, passports and the details on passports don't count, and driving licenses don't count. Those have been sort of ruled as specifically not being cognitive function tests, but they are a transcription from usually like a physical piece of media into a computer. So they still do provide a layer of difficulty, especially for people with cognitive disabilities. They don't count. Sorry for sounding bitter. I'm just trying to make it dramatic. But yes, according to both the AA and AAA levels of this, we only need to make logins more accessible, not the full journey. So we could leave it at that. But I'm going to suggest we break the rules a little bit. I'm going to suggest we do revisit the use of CAPTCHAs everywhere when we're going through this stuff. I'm going to say that we should make the sign-up process accessible. People aren't going to be able to log in if they're not able to sign up. And then I also say that we should recognize how difficult it can be to find, read, and enter official identification numbers as well, and look into ways to making that process easier as well. But also make logins accessible. It is a really important, valuable thing to be doing. And I think WCAG 2.2 is right to be focusing on and trying to make logins more accessible. That being said, yeah, let's go into the details of making logins more accessible. We've said it a few times now. We've said there's more than just making logins accessible, but what's actually in making logins accessible? So generally, there's 4 areas that I've found where accessible authentication comes up within the login process. They're entering credentials into inputs, verifying if it's a legitimate human request, verifying if it's a request from a very specific human, and then multi-factor authentication as well. So we'll go through each of those. And this is where I would say take notes, but it's all sort of in the slides, so you can come back to it later. But this is the piece that is basically trying to just sum up all the different areas where accessible authentication, and especially in that understanding document, touch on what are the practical things for a login process that a team will have to consider. So for entering credentials, I'll just go through these. I'm just going to read the slide, unfortunately. Up number 1, don't block copying and pasting for inputs. Number 2, don't or allow people to use autofill features. Number 3, provide a method to show password characters. Usually some sort of like show hide mechanism there. Number 4, allow password managers to access the fields. So whether that's browser password managers or third-party ones, allow them to manage the passwords. Don't block that. And then finally, add proper HTML autocomplete attributes. So this is sort of a suite of things to do that'll make it so that the transcription portion of the cognitive function tests, typing things into fields in order to get through the login, become easier and have sort of supporting mechanisms for people. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's a bit more in the slide notes, but I don't think it's worth dwelling on too long. And we'll go to the next one. So how do you make sure it's a legitimate human request then? Or when that's happening, when a login is deciding whether it's a legitimate human request, how do we make that accessible? So this sort of goes through like from top to bottom, like the first option and then going down. So the first one is try alternatives before adding CAPTCHA. There's a series of alternatives, which I think I'll show on the next slide, but try them before reaching for the CAPTCHA option. For many different types of logins, many different services, many applications, a CAPTCHA may not even be needed, as they do often require cognitive function tests in some form or another. The other one is look for CAPTCHA with accessible controls. So at the very least, if you're going to have a CAPTCHA, make sure people can interact with it, with screen readers, with keyboard access, with various other assistive technologies as well. Because if they can't access the actual CAPTCHA to do it, that's also going to be a failure. The other one is offer multiple sensory formats. So what's meant by that is that sort of like give alternatives to the CAPTCHA in different formats. So if it is going to be a CAPTCHA that uses images, also provide an option that is audio based as well. Don't rely on maths or logic puzzles. So that was also what the accessibility monitoring body said. It's just not the way to go, basically. And then the last one, provide alternative verification options. And it looked like I was going to give an example and didn't. I think the example I was going to give comes to like help options. Like if this process is trying to verify someone and they're going to get locked out, basically, if they can't complete the check if this is a real human, give them backup options, have a way for them to still resolve this, even if it involves getting a person involved. That's still better than absolutely blocking them forever. Yeah, so some alternatives to CAPTCHA, and these are pulled from a few different resources I found, as well as just brainstorming. But there actually was a really good resource I found near the end of making this list from the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, which is the group that makes WCAG. And they have a whole sort of draft note on the inaccessibility of CAPTCHA and some alternatives to it. So I won't put that in the chat. Maybe you can grab that from the notes, Kelly. It's just that Turing test one there. But yeah, basically using human or automated review of submissions can go a long way, especially for things like forms. You may not actually need to use a CAPTCHA for things like forms. Similarly for forms, honeypot form fields. So that's sort of like a fake field that is only meant for robots to see and robots to be like, ooh, I want to fill that out, is a great way to catch robots in the act. Other options are using non-interactive confidence scores. That's a very poorly worded term, but basically things like Google's reCAPTCHA version 3 and above, where you don't actually see anything on the screen for the CAPTCHA. It just behind the scenes says like, yeah, this person's good to go. Generally, though, those confidence intervals only work to a certain point, and then they fall back to other less accessible captchas. So that's sort of the current state that's trying to be fixed with this piece from WCAG. Multi-factor authentication is another way to verify, maybe not so much if they're human, but if it's the same person logging in again and again, which then negates the need to figure out if they're human, if it is a request from the same type of entity that has access to the same devices. And then spam filtering. A lot of the times, especially for things like forms or applications, we don't really need to know if they're not human. We just need to know if they're spam. All right, so the third area is determining within a process whether a request is from a specific human. How do we do that? Or what do we need to consider when we're figuring out if it's from a specific human? So say it's from John who lives in X house versus, I don't know, John's mother or something. So first of all, consider whether it's actually necessary in each case, because it becomes quite a burden in order to determine whether someone's a specific human. This is sort of where those things like select the picture that you chose as your security picture, or what's your mother's maiden name. Those sort of things come into play when it's trying to figure out if it's a specific human. And those often involve a lot of cognitive function tests as well. So the other thing, and this comes from WCAG 2.2's new criteria here, is don't ask to recall transactions or details, especially transaction or details that are text-based. So asking which of the, like, what did you pay for last Tuesday? And then having them try to figure out what it was, not accessible to do that. Avoid asking to identify personal content as well. So I think this is an example of this is something Facebook did a few years ago, where they would say, which of these 9 pictures do you own? And it wasn't stuff that the person had already seen. That's written here as avoid though, because this is allowed under the AA level, but it's not allowed at the AAA level. And then don't ask for transcription. So if you are going to do any of this, like having people identify their personal content, identify pictures, don't ask for transcription, present options to them. Don't make them have to type it out by hand. And then finally, don't present sensitive info before the login. So if you are doing something like, which of these pictures do you own? Don't make it pictures from their camera roll that aren't public, because then the person who's trying to log in can see all their sensitive or all their private photos suddenly, which is not great. And the last one we'll go to is multi-factor authentication, often called two-factor authentication because it's usually just 2 factors that we go for. But yeah, so when going through this, consider these things. Consider whether there's even value in requiring 2 factors. For certain applications, you may not need it. For certain applications, you probably definitely should have it though. So yeah, check, and the answer won't always be that you don't need it. And then, yeah, so if there are verification code input fields is how I worded it, but like the place where you type those 5 or 6 characters, those need to allow paste. That's sort of something that's directly said in the understanding document of like, if you're going to have like a text-based thing and someone has to potentially get it on a different device and then email it to their other device and then copy it from their email and paste it in, it's not a great experience, but at the very least, that field should allow pasting. And then, yeah, the next part builds on that. Avoid a journey that requires transcribing. So that thing I said there, where like because someone isn't able to like transcribe directly from one device to the other, having to make them go around in other ways to get the information onto the other device. Avoid doing that if you can. Have ways for it to be sort of on the same device. This is actually a category where I hope some operating systems do a bit of work there. I know like iOS definitely tries to pull in 2-factor authentication messages that come in and sort of offer the code in the copy and paste area. That's not something that individual services will be able to do, but potentially if this continues being like a piece people are talking about and hoping for, it is something that will grow in its interoperability between devices as well. And then just sort of a note at the end that second factors that are generally good to go as far as the various documents I read say are like hardware-based second factors. So that would be like I forget what they call them, but like authentication, like physical authentication keys, where you can like plug it into a laptop and then it that counts as like a second factor, or ones that show codes and stuff like that. Those are generally, as far as the WCAG criteria here are concerned, are good to go. Although there are still obviously like consider the journey for those as well, because they're not immediately accessible just for being hardware. And then biometrics as well, if they're given from operating systems. And I specifically put that caveat from operating systems because I don't think your local council should be collecting your retina details, or your fingerprint. But it is sort of a thing built into operating systems now. So you have Windows Hello, and you have Face ID, and there's probably something in Android as well that I should know, but there's too many from Android to count. But biometrics that are built in the operating system and then can be exchanged to provide verification and authentication are a decent way to go that don't use cognitive function tests. All right, I'm gonna breathe nice and slow here because I'm now going into notes on CAPTCHA, and there might be a little bit of spice ahead. All right. So once again, I'm being more dramatic. I don't think this is actually that spicy, but if you disagree, raise your hand and we'll talk about it. So the spiciness here is that both the AA and the higher level AAA levels for these WCAG 2.2 sort of new criteria added, both technically allow the use of CAPTCHAs as a concept, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but also most of the common CAPTCHA tools that exist here and now today aren't going to meet that AAA level. So the thing that makes most like mainstream CAPTCHAs today, or like a handful of the mainstream CAPTCHAs acceptable right now, is that exception for recognizing objects. So if it's recognizing objects or a picture the user has provided, so that user personal information piece, that is a cognitive function test still, but they're allowing it at the AA level. And I don't think that's done for accessibility reasons. I think that's done because that's just what's on the market right now, basically. And then, yeah, the allowance of CAPTCHAs at all within accessible authentication doesn't necessarily mean CAPTCHAs are inclusive, is another thing to keep in mind. Like by design, the idea of especially the original idea for these Turing tests was through behavior, through ability, through capability, be able to determine what's a human and what's a computer. And the tests for which you do that by design create barriers and create distinctions between different groups of humans. And often people with accessibility needs, and especially cognitive accessibility needs, are placed on one side of that barrier. It is something that has been seen a lot with, I think it's specifically reCAPTCHA v3, where that's the one where like for a while it was just you check a box saying I'm not a robot and it does it all in the background. It would often fail for people that are using screen readers and the like because they appeared more robotic than someone interacting in a different way. I think I can source that, but maybe don't ask me to, because I did find a source for it, but it was buried a lot further than I expected. But basically, the point at which those like less interaction, no cognitive function test ones kick in and start saying like my confidence is getting too low, this might be a robot. The confidence levels for people using assistive technology are much lower than the confidence levels for people browsing without assistive technology. And this is something that can probably be iterated on over time, but it is sort of an inherent trick of CAPTCHAs where it's trying to make distinctions between what makes a human interaction and what makes a computer interaction. But yeah, the main point being having a CAPTCHA sit inside a login process doesn't make the CAPTCHA any more or less inaccessible. So why are we saying the only place where we care about what CAPTCHAs do is within a login process? So yeah, in this case, I recommend not letting WCAG dictate how far your team goes in building accessible services. Make the whole journey accessible. So this applies for the whole thing, but I'm specifically saying this for CAPTCHAs now because they are such like a weird space, and their concept is by design to erect barriers for people. So if your team has CAPTCHAs or is using a login process, and has like cognitive function tests built in, make your whole service journey accessible while you're working on this portion of it. So anywhere, if you're going to fix CAPTCHAs in one place, fix them everywhere, because there's no magical thing that makes a CAPTCHA inaccessible inside a login and accessible other places. And then I got a bonus note from the understanding document, which is that the criterion still applies to CAPTCHAs that only appear sometimes, like after entering a password incorrectly multiple times. So if you do have the thing where generally the CAPTCHA doesn't come in and you're fine to go, and then in a small sliver of cases, it'll pop up CAPTCHA because you've entered your password too many times, or you're on an incognito browser, or it just doesn't have a high enough confidence rate that you are a human, this still applies. So they do make that very explicit. This isn't a case of the happy path or the regular path for logins. This is all paths for logins. Need to take note of how their CAPTCHAs are used and making sure if a CAPTCHA is used that it's done accessibly. And that's the end of my CAPTCHA rant. Thank you all. Sorry for that. To sum it all up, accessible authentication makes login experiences both better and more accessible. But the lessons that are given here for login processes extend beyond logins as well. My personal plan going forward is I'm going to pretend that accessible authentication applies to all forms of authentication, not just logins. Doesn't mean you have to do that, but that's what I'm going to do. And why that's my plan is because authentication processes, wherever they are stressful already. This is beyond just login authentication. They're stressful everywhere. They require increased cognitive effort everywhere, and they often will act as a pass-fail barrier for real people. So if you fail in any sort of authentication place, whether it's submitting a form, whether it's uploading a file, potentially that can be like a stopping factor for someone trying to do something. So yeah. And that is the conclusion. It's all summed up. And now we're going to go into questions. So I'll hand it back over to Steve now, but I think I'll keep the slides up on my screen, Steve.
Yeah.
But yeah, if there's any questions from the chat, or if anyone wants to use the raise hands feature, let's go for it.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, David. So yeah, if you use the raise hand feature, you can sort of ask a question, but people have been asking questions as we've been going. So if it's okay, I'll just go over a couple of those, if that's okay, David. So we had a really interesting question that said, obviously, this criterion is talking about login, and you've sort of said, actually, it would be really useful if we sort of extended that beyond the login experience. But I think this is still quite a useful question to have answered. So does the guidance say anywhere like what we mean by login? Does it sort of try and define what a login experience is?
I can answer this because I've asked it myself. So there's two different points where it could provide a definition. I think in the actual guideline text itself, it uses the term authentication process, and it does not define that. I've asked whether that can be defined. It looks like it'll be a bit too tough to define that one. But if you go into the understanding document, there's also a term which is login, which if we're not going to define authentication process, we may as well like at least write guidance that this is what a login is, and this is what a login is not, and this is what's not covered. So I have a plan in the future to suggest that they add a section in the understanding document, which is something that is a bit more like it can evolve over time, even after this is published and this is now a recommendation. So potentially to add like a little section on here's what is a login and here's what's not a login, just to make it crystal clear. And you don't have to get it from like a back alley presentation from someone in a design system somewhere. What exactly.
Okay, so they're not actually defining what a login is at the moment. They're sort of relying on teams to understand what a login is and what authentication is. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Another question, which looks quite interesting. Does voice recognition authentication apply?
I think voice recognition authentication would fall into a few different pieces. I've like as an example of a few different pieces. So I think it would fall in as an example of an alternative, especially when you're talking about using like different sensory modes. And I think it would also fall in as a piece of biometrics where its voice identification is not necessarily a cognitive function test. It's not a cognitive test. But bear in mind, it does rely on, once again, like some assumptions about people. And those assumptions being that their voice stays the same over time, they're able to speak at all times when they're trying to authenticate, and other pieces like that. So it definitely should not be the only option for authentication. It definitely should not be, in my opinion, the default option for authentication either, because that makes assumptions about people's voices and their ability to speak consistently and over time.
It's a really good point there, isn't it? So like people's voices do change. I think I even sound different today to what I did yesterday. But obviously, if you're having sort of like an operation on your vocal cords, that's going to change the way that you sound. So services providing different types of authentication or sort of security verification is probably the way to go. Finally, another question that we've had. So some of the stuff that we've been talking about, will the design system guidance include what we've been talking about?
I keep muting. I probably shouldn't. Yes, I can. There is a slide at the very end which shows specifically which of the patterns are going to have a bit on accessible authentication. It is the case though that like this is a bit of a cop out for us where we haven't done a lot of patterns on the authentication process to this point. So getting our design system to comply with WCAG 2.2 is easier in that way, where there's a lot of untouched like categories and areas where we just don't have guidance on it now. So we don't have to update that guidance. So the answer is yes, the stuff we have is getting updates. There's three patterns that which we'll get. I think it's like passwords, confirm a phone number, which is like our two-factor authentication, and there's a third one. It'll say on a slide later. And then we are also looking to add a component to make accessible authentication easier. But yeah, that's about as far as we're going. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a space where it's like, oh, we meet it by not having all that much to do with it so far.
Yeah, thanks for covering that. I suppose, yeah, that's the one thing to say is that we are going to be looking at adding a show hide password component, which is already used on the Gov.UK account and is also used on Gov.UK One login. So we'll be bringing that into the design system. So that'll be available for people. Before we move on to the next section, did anyone want to raise their hand and share anything or ask any questions? Martin, go for it.
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to have a follow-up on my question in the chat. What I'd meant, David, was you've taken the WCAG AA approach, which we'll all have to meet, but then you've said you personally feel that we should go a bit further than that. So I'm wondering whether that's a personal opinion, whether it will end up in either the design system guidance or in some way in GDS guidance or the service manual, so that if you're building a service, effectively you're both meeting WCAG and looking to GDS officially saying go a bit further. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. That does make sense. I think there's potential it could be put in as something the Gov.UK design system does. I don't think it would be something that we would put into what we say other teams need to do, because at the end of the day, yeah, we're only gonna, unfortunately, we're in a regulatory environment where like the thing that like is the barrier or is the like the threshold for accessibility and like that is WCAG 2.2 within the space, and the accessibility monitoring team will be monitoring against WCAG 2.2. So I think potentially, like, yes, the teams that I'm working on and we have an accessibility strategy, this may be something that could be added to that in the future. And that would be something that I would personally advocate for adding on like an individual team level. As far as an organization level, that would need to be an level decision for each organization. I don't think it would be a government-wide level decision because the government-wide approach is based on legislation, if that.
Cool. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, David. I think we might just have time for one more. So I can see Tom's raised his hand. Tom, do you want to let us know what you want to ask?
Yeah, hi there. Hi, David. Nice to meet you, fellow Canadian here. Hello. Enjoy your trip back. Hopefully it goes smoothly. Yeah, I just wanted to point out, really good presentation. Thank you. And I'm really glad you mentioned the invisible reCAPTCHA version 3, because I was actually trying to tackle this, CAPTCHA issue over at our design work at Money and Pension Service, and came across reCAPTCHA version 3, and I was thinking, how effective is it really? It was helpful to hear that you also kind of independently confirmed or found that it only works to a certain point, because that was kind of where I got to as well. And then, of course, it falls back to less accessible alternatives. I had a quick question about HCAPTCHA. Have you heard about this? Do you have a thought about how effective? I think it's HCAPTCHA, if I'm remembering the term correctly. Does this ring a bell?
No, sorry, I'm not aware of HCAPTCHA, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was another alternative that I found. Anyway, I'm just going to triple check the term is correct. Yeah, it is HCAPTCHA. Okay, I'll leave it there, but thanks.
Yeah, I think the general ideas for CAPTCHA still apply, which is like not having a function test, making sure the controls are accessible through various assistive technologies and like interaction methods, and then going from there basically. And also just like is the Turing test people fit in a box or don't, which is when it gets a little bit dicey, where to a certain point they all do. So it's kind of like picking the least, the most inclusive uninclusion possible that still gets the job done. Is it okay, Steve, we just take the final question from?
Should be. We've got an hour left. Do you think that will give us enough time to do the breakout rooms? Yeah.
We can cut a minute off of the next question.
Okay, let's do that. Tanya. You're on mute, Tanya. Sorry.
Yeah. I just wanted to kind of thank you. The presentation was great. I'm a user researcher working for a local government. But what I struggled and what I kind of want to pick up your brains about is I have two very inaccessible ways in which I have been personally locked out of my account. One is with HM Revenue and Customs. And it's like, oh, that's great. And then the other one is a DWP access to work, how inaccessible that is. And I was wondering if you have any sort of like, I don't know, best practices or things like that when we are working in these environments, like how can we ensure we're providing, the right level of service in those areas? Because the assumptions there are, well, the people are, if you're going for an access to work with DWP, it's like you only have to call them. That's the best way. There is no written information. There's nothing. So yeah, sorry. It's a bit of a loaded question, but like,
no worries.
Please do. Spill your brains out. Thank you.
I think I'll go a bit more generic on this one, unfortunately. So I think generally, like, building an accessible service at any level, and this includes like the login authentication processes, takes some level of commitment to like working with users, doing user research, and then also looking at service design, figuring out like what is the full journey and what are the potential places where barriers are introduced within that journey. So I think it goes beyond just like, I can't really point to a document and say like, oh, this WCAG criteria here fixes all the problems. It is more of like, it will take investment, it will take time. And it's something that within an organization, as you said, funding gets prioritized, right? So making sure that we're prioritizing funding to like, potentially it's a pick and choose where like certain services get the attention first. I know there are programs within the government where like the top 75 are being looked at, the top 75 services to be looked at for like, let's get these in a really great situation first, and then we'll move on to the next ones and stuff like that. So it does come down to like operational pieces at the end of the day sometimes with like where accessibility comes in and what gets prioritized first. But yeah, commitment to like service design, user research, and sort of designing with accessibility from the start is definitely the way to go. And I think I'll move us along at that point. Thank you for the question. Quickly, we'll go through some inspection tips, because the next thing we're going to go into next is the breakout rooms and actually doing this interactively with each other. Actually, no, we're going to go into a demo. Oh gosh, I forgot about the demo. That's why Steve was saying we didn't have enough time. Okay, great. We're going to speed through this. It's going to be great. It's lovely. Okay, I took too long in the first part. So yeah, some tips for when you're actually going through services, especially if you're on a service team, is try the full login process yourself. So this is that idea of like service design, of checking out the full service journey. Try out the full login process from start to finish, and see if there's any points where there's increased effort, where there's I have to go do a thing, I have to go think, I have to get this document. Interact with inputs as well. So as you're going through it, try copying and pasting into various inputs, whether it's username, password, all those sort of things. Look for show hide options on the passwords. So if there's any sort of like hidden fields where you get the stars or the dot instead of text, see if there's a way to turn that back into text, just so you can see what's there. Look for cognitive tests as well. So see if you're being asked to recognize objects at any point, see if there's maths and other skill-based. If in the login process or within the sign up process or within anywhere in your service, there's suddenly what's 2 + 4, maybe that's a sign that you've got a cognitive function test going on. And then also if you're being asked to interpret from images or audio, that's another way to see whether there's a cognitive test going on there. And the last one, slightly more technical, but this covers something that they specifically mentioned in the WCAG understanding document, is use the browser inspector tools to see if the inputs are built properly as well. So specifically look to see if the autocomplete attributes are set to the right values. So this sort of autocomplete equals and then a thing is something that's built into HTML to help things like password managers and autofill fill in fields for people, which is one of those really helpful mechanisms. So a password is set to password. I think there's one called new password for when you're adding a new password. Make sure those are set properly so that autofill will work properly for them and help people complete the login. Now we're going to go into a demo. It is a bit of a shorter one than most times. So the first thing I'm going to do as the demo is I'm going to open a incognito window here. So this is that private browsing window again. And I'm going to paste in the first sign-in process I'm going to try, which is outlook.com. I've chosen this one because I did it a bunch when I was setting up for the breakouts we have later. And I noticed it had some pretty interesting factors going on. Signing in. I know sign up part of accessible authentication, but I think this, from what I was, a lot of the interesting features are stuck inside the sign up process. So we're going to see a lot more of them in there. Has it frozen?
It did, but we've got you back now. So, but it only froze for like 20 seconds. So maybe like, I think you were covering on the Outlook page, like what were the strange things? So maybe you just say that again.
Okay, yeah, I didn't quite get there, but I'll say, yeah, I'm looking at a sign up process first rather than a login process, because as I was preparing for these demos and this breakout set, I found a lot of the interesting and like valuable things to look at for this demo are found in the sign up processes rather than the login processes. You get into the more complex like cognitive function tests for login when you get to higher security information. And we're not going to demo high security information because that's going to be personal information. That's going to be like either like bank statements, that's going to be like admin controls, that's going to be like my passport details. So I didn't want to demo those. So we're going to cheat a bit and use the sign-up processes, which show some of those cognitive function tests instead. But the breakouts later will have a sign up first and then a login. So you get some of the taste of the more like complex stuff, and then you get the real thing that WCAG 2.2 is about. So I'm going to create a new account here. It's going to be called Workshop Sample David. Nice name for an email. Hopefully it's free. And then I'm going to go with an outlook.com email ending here. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open the inspect tool here, and I'm just going to check if it's got any sort of helpers on it. So it has autocomplete equals off, which I think at this point you'd have to turn to your developers and say, is that okay? I can't check off the top of my head, but I think it makes sense because this is inputting a new email. You're probably not going to have like a new email address stored somewhere. So it makes sense that it wouldn't be autofilling with one of your previous existing emails. It did actually for me. So that's actually the browser taking over and not listening to the autocomplete equals off. But generally, that seems like it's an a-okay time for that to be used, but it shouldn't be used in other places. And here, I'm not seeing anything wildly exciting about this select here, but it is a select that lets you choose from Outlook or Hotmail options. All right, the next one we've got is create a password. So I'm just going to inspect this one again, see what it's done with the autocomplete. So it hasn't turned off autocomplete, which is great. It hasn't specifically allowed it, which I think also makes sense because this is a net new password. Actually, it doesn't make sense. It probably should have autocomplete equals new password in this case. But I'm going to create a password now. So I'll type in a password, and then I'm going to check this show password to see if that shows the password. It does, and I typed it wrong. So good that was there. So this is me. And I'm also going to copy the email address, so I get that for later as well. And I'm not going to sign up for the tips and offers. So at this point, it's giving me an error. I haven't quite right. I think that it's so I'm going to choose a different password now. There we go. They're nice and secure. Best ever seen. And we'll see if this one gets through. There we go. So now it's asking for my name. It's got some autofills on there. Input type is text. It doesn't. This is where you'd have to ask a developer because it was, oh, that's because I've previously done this. Okay, but potentially there could be like an autocomplete option for first name and surname. Generally, people may not use those all the time, but there are people for which using the autocomplete features is a huge time saver for them. So they use a bunch of them potentially. But my name is Workshop. My last name is Sample. Moving on, my date of birth. I'm in the United Kingdom, and it is January 1st, 1975. Obviously, that's not a fake birth date. I would never do that. And now we get to the thing that excited me a little bit. Got a nice little pop-up here that says, please solve the puzzle so we know you're not a robot. And then it's got an excellent little code to it and a cute little robot. And you'll notice it's got an audio option here as well. So I'm going to click that just to see what happens. So this is called the audio challenge. It actually moved my focus to audio challenge, so that's great as well. And it says which option is repeating pattern. I don't think I'm sharing audio, so unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to demo it. Just see if you can hear this, I suppose.
No, I don't think anything's coming through.
Okay, I don't think that's coming through. It's weird. Okay. Maybe I'll go through the other part first. I'll do the visual one, but it's good to show that they do have an alternative that is audio based, and it looked like the controls were available through keyboard as well. So we have here, use the arrows to rotate the animal to face in the direction of the hand. This is the first time I'd seen one like this. And then there's arrows here, and it shows you how many different steps there are. So you can rotate the animal and have it face in the direction of the hand. So if I press submit now, oh, it tells me I got it wrong. It says that was not quite right. Make sure the animal is facing in the same direction that the hand is pointing towards. And it gives an example of what that would look like when done correctly. So this does not count as a help mechanism, but it is more accessible for them to show how you're getting it wrong than to show this is incorrect, try it again. So I would say this is a cognitive function test, but it does look like they're putting in quite a bit of work to make it a cognitive function test that has supports built in. Whether or not this counts as object recognition or whether it counts as a logic test, I think is something that would be up for debate. I don't actually think that's covered under the understanding document right now as to whether image-based logic tests are okay. They do say if it's look at this image and count how many bunnies there are, that's not a cognitive function test, or that is a cognitive function test, and that is a math test. That is not an image recognition test. But this is about angles, I suppose. I don't know what this one would be basically, but I think it does still count as a cognitive function test regardless, even if it is a more accessible and available cognitive function test potentially.
School of Computing, Engineering and Mathematical Sciences.
So I'm gonna do it again, and this time I'll try to get it right. So we've got a 3D seal here. I'm going to rotate it until it matches the direction of the fingers. And then because I got it wrong the first time, I think it's gonna ask me to do it twice. Yes. So I submit it now, and the verification is complete. And it takes me through, the process has been successful, and it should show me sort of a welcome screen with a bunch of information on it. There we go. So that's that one. And now we're gonna go to the other demo real quick. All right, so this is, it is what it says. So it says create a gov.uk one login or sign in. And the one I'm gonna try right now is create a gov.uk one login. So I'll enter an email address. I think the one I just made, I don't remember what it was. Oh, I wrote it down, good for me. Let's see if I can copy and paste. I can copy and paste. So that's already that part checked off. Moving to continue. It now says check your email. So good thing I use that email. I'm going to go to my new email inbox and I'm going to see if I have an email. Oh. There we go. It just tried to run me through the creation process again. But here we go. Oh, look at that. I've got an email. So this email is, it's from the gov.uk one login as well, which was the name of the place I just was. And it says, use the security code to confirm the email address for your gov.uk one login. It tells you, it doesn't tell you how to use it, but it does tell you how long it's available for. And if you need help, it has contact details as well. I have seen other emails like this where it'll say, if you want to make it easier for yourself, double click double select them and then copy. So it makes it obvious that you can do that. You can also click and drag. Obviously that only works for certain devices like desktops. On a phone, it might be something like a long press. But I've now copied that. Now I'll bring it back and I will enter it in here. I'm going to use paste just to test that out. It worked. Now when I press continue, it asked me to create a password. And this is why I'm demoing this one, is because it has show hide labels here as well in this format. These are the ones we're sort of investigating at the moment. So I'm going to create a password and I'm going to use a password, which will come up later. So paste it in, it shows up like that. I press show, it shows up like that. And I'm also going to inspect if they have autocomplete formats for this. autocomplete equals new password is in the code when I expect. So that was the piece I was trying to talk about earlier. There is specifically an autocomplete value for new password fields as well. So I'm going to retype the password now. I'll show that as well. Looks like they match. It even has some advice on how to create a good password, but I'm going to ignore that for now because I like my password just the way it is. So when I press continue, it goes through an authentication process now, and it tells me how I want to get security codes. For the moment, I might just stop at this point, but this would be another thing to look through as well. It gives different options, text message, and that would be sort of a multi-device piece where you'd need to find a way to transfer between the two devices potentially, unless you are doing this on a phone. And then the authentication app for smartphone, tablet, or computer, that could conceivably be done on the same device, depending on the person's setup. I will stop there though, because I know we're running out of time. So that's sort of the two authentication processes. And I'll just show a login process for the Outlook one, because that should be fairly quick. So I'll go to Outlook.com again and press sign in this time. And now it asks me for my email. So I'm going to paste it in because it looks like it isn't quite saved in my computer yet. Workshop sample David. And then I'll take a password. I'm going to copy and paste that in. You'll note there's no way for me to verify whether I've typed it in correctly. There's no show hide password option here. But when I press sign in, it gives me an option as to whether I want to stay signed in to make it easier for next time, depending on which device I'm on. I'll say yes. It's not going to matter in this case. And I'm logged in. So that's sort of the sign-in process where a lot of accessible authentication would come in. In this case, it didn't show any CAPTCHA, but there is a chance if I had repeatedly gotten my password wrong, it might have started showing a password. So that's something that's worth checking as well, is what happens when you do the login process incorrectly. So yeah, that's that. And I think we're going to move back to the slides and see what's next.
Does anyone have any questions? So we have been sort of like making notes of the questions as they come up, but yeah, if you've got something you want to ask, please do raise your hand and we can ask it as well. So David, I don't know whether this is going to be sort of covered or if you sort of know about this, but what do you think of magic links? So you know when you sort of start a login process and you don't have to enter a password, you just enter your email address, and then this is a link is sent to your email and you sort of click that link and then that ends up signing you in. Do you have any sort of views on that?
They don't count as cognitive function tests. I think that's the easiest view to take on that. Whether they are something that's sustainable or like a good idea overall, I'll say it's something that like I've personally recommended teams explore, especially for systems where you don't need sort of a persistent like logging into the same system all the time. So things especially like short-term like forms or application processes where you might need it for maybe a couple months and then you're not going to need it ever again. Those are great for like magic links. But yeah, I think someone raised their hand if they have like a really good like don't do this. But generally, those sort of magic links do pass the threshold of like it's not a cognitive function test. Yes, okay. Francesco.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I have a first of all, sorry my English, and I have a question. Before you show the login of Windows Outlook, I think, and when you put the password, they don't show you the I for check the password. This is be considered now with this new rule not cover the new rule of WCAG?
Yes, yeah. Maybe I breezed over that a little too quickly. Yes, so there was no show hide password option when I was doing the login for Outlook.com. So that would be a very specific point that is a failure for WCAG 2.2 accessible authentication. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Just this question, I don't know if I'm out of the new topic, but I have this question. Thanks for all.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you, Francesco. We've got Ian next.
Hi, thanks, David. It's a great presentation. What I'm just trying to get clarity on is when people are signing in and they get a OTP on a second device, the mobile, and they're on a desktop, they're having to transcribe that OTP, aren't they, onto the desktop to put it into that input field. Is copying and pasting that and emailing it to yourself, is that a method to get around that, or is that just simply a failure if there's not another option for signing in or for transcribing that code?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on the solution in the like if there's not another option. So providing one-time passcodes through like text message, not a bad thing, but providing different options allows people to pick the one that's going to most likely work for them, especially if there is like a barrier to transcription. So potentially if they're on their desktop and they're logged into their email already, getting an email one-time passcode is the way to go. Potentially if they're on their phone and it's got like a phone number, doing a text-based one is the way to go. And then the one that bridges both of those, depending on their setup, could be an authentication app. So giving options is definitely the way to go. I'll also note, I don't think I said this in the thing. The understanding document right now for accessible authentication has a very, very long paragraph on how the intent of this is to make it so that transcription isn't needed for two-factor authentication. But they also acknowledge that that's kind of a problem to solve at potentially the operating system level or like the interoperability of devices that people own. So they don't have a direct, perfect answer to how to transfer one-time passcodes and two-factor authentication passcodes from one device to another. And they say, basically, they get to the point where like, this is something you should consider and definitely make it as easy as possible. And consider like interoperability of the ways you're sending those passcodes, because the worst case scenario would be someone has to like copy it from their text message, draft an email to themselves, send that email to their email, open their email from their desktop, copy that out and paste it. And they say technically that passes, but it's a terrible experience basically.
So given if there's no other option at the moment, we could say, well, that's the method, even though it's, as you say, it's not great, but it's not a failure. So we don't have to declare it. Or
I think putting like supports around that as a process is the way to go. So as I said, there was an email option for a one-time passcode I saw where it actually says in it like consider or like if you're having trouble with transcribing, consider copying this and then pasting it in. So giving people like hints and just trying to make like the user experience as close as possible. Because for some people, this is like a major point of like difficulty. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Ian. So before we finish, we'll just share some more resources. I'll just run through these very quickly, but they're in the document that you have been given earlier, and we'll obviously like share these a bit afterwards as well. So here's the link to the What's New informational page, which was, sorry, I accidentally clicked a button there. This is the link to the Web Accessibility Initiative's guidelines for what's new in 2.2, and it just sort of tells you what's new in the new guidelines. There's also a blog post here from the Gov.UK One Login team, which is written by Ben Andrews and sort of talks about how they're improving inclusion for digital identity in government. And you can also go and have a look at the work that we're doing, like our project board. We don't use Jira, we use GitHub projects, but you can actually see all of the stuff that we're working on. And so we'll share some of these links so that you'll be able to see how we're progressing on show hide password, and then also updating the pattern guidance for confirming an email address, passwords, and also creating an account.